Thanks, Joann, for joining me for a little bit of living history. How did you first get interested in forestry? A little bit of your background there.
Well, first of all, thanks for asking. Very, very flattered and very excited to be a part of the program. Um, my interest in forestry started very early from a large family, and our summertime vacations were taking camping trips all over the U.S. I really enjoyed being outside, and I was watching rangers talk about, and share their stories around campfire sessions, et cetera. And I thought, wow, what a neat job. And so when I was a junior in high school, I said, okay, I want to be a forester. Wasn't quite sure what all that was, but I began to explore and look at different colleges. And so thus began kind of that career of finding out what forestry was about. And it was a choice that I have never regretted, because it's been a really a rich and rewarding career path.
You mentioned that you went to Texas A&M. How did you arrive at that school, and what kind of other schooling did you have, an educational background?
At the time I was getting out of high school, we were actually living in New Jersey. And so I started my forestry education at within the Rutgers University system at Cook College, which is their agricultural school. My folks and my dad got transferred down to Texas, and that got me to start looking at forestry schools in East Texas. I opted to go to Texas A&M. I and another lady, we were the first two women to get our undergraduate degrees in Texas A&M.
I'm curious, as you were considering forestry, being a woman, did you anticipate being kind of this first role, and what was it like?
So recognizing the fact that I was entering into a typically men's profession, I knew there would be some challenges, and I'll be honest, in some cases, there were some extreme challenges. And as I look back and think about it, I was very determined. Essentially, early on, there was a lot of twisting and turning, and there was a lot of learning on both ends, right? Not only myself entering into a man's profession, but on the flip side, the folks that I was working with, the folks that had hired me. So we had learnings on both sides. And fortunately for me, I had some very good mentors who happened to have teenage daughters. And I think they saw the future of their own daughters.
What kind of forestry work did you do, and are you continuing to do in your career?
So the bulk of my forestry career really worked with industry. I started my career with Champion International in East Texas and moved around and had a variety of jobs with them. I always say I did work for International Paper for 2 weeks when IP bought out Champion. And then I went to work for Georgia Pacific, which brought me up to North Carolina. I worked for Georgia Pacific almost 4 years, but always in the back of my mind was actually to work for myself. And after roughly 4 years with Georgia Pacific, I wound up resigning and opening my little private company, focused specifically on doing forest certification audit work.
So thinking back over your career, how about a story that comes to mind?
I mean, I've done a little bit of reflection, and there's actually, if there's time, I have two stories I'd like to share, but there's certainly others, but some of those are better told with a cold beer in a hand. So the first story I wanted to talk about was my experience as a junior procurement forester. Time frame was about 1985 in East Texas. The region I operated in was just northwest of Houston over to the Beaumont, Port Arthur area. I didn't have much input into which tracts I was going to be assigned to manage and get. And I never forget the sly smile that the senior procurement forester, who was a St. Regis person, now Champion folks, said, well, Joann, I've got a track over northwest of Houston I'd like you to have. It's Mr. Ingram's, and here's the package. So I said, great, eager, ready to please. Mr. Ingram was a very successful businessman. He owned a pipe company that supplied the oil and gas. And he had his favorite retreat, which was the Circle I Ranch. And this was where some timber stumpage had been purchased by St. Regis, now Champion. It was about 200 acres of about a 25-year-old pine plantation. And this was Mr. Ingram's getaway retreat, so pretty special place for him. And as I read the conditions of the contract, I started to get a clue of what the challenges that were going to lie ahead. Because Mr. Ingram was a very avid big game hunter. And the timber sale area was home for some of his exotic game species that he had on the property. There were 3 red, beautiful, massive red stags. There was a small herd of axis deer and some other game species. And the other aspect of the contract was that he wanted 100 trees scattered across this 200 acres that I would identify and we would not cut. And it was a yaupon thicket. It had never been managed other than getting the trees in the ground. And the important part of the yaupon was I had to assure Mr. Ingram that the yaupon was not killed, because this is what his game animals grazed on. I realized that my first task was to figure out I needed a people person kind of logger. And I was able to check that box off. The second aspect was trying to convince Mr. Ingram to reconsider his request of 100 trees scattered across the property. East Texas gets notoriously lightning-filled thunderstorms that go by. So all I could envision was I was creating 100 lightning rods out there. And I can remember my first interaction with meeting Mr. Ingram and having that conversation about trying to change the contract and considering moving those 100 trees along the perennial stream. I could, as I was giving my excellent explanation of why this was a good idea, all the benefits from a forest management standpoint, I kept watching his blank, stern stare looking at me, and I could see those wheels going. And I was imagining his internal thoughts were, how dare this young female forester tell me what to do? Doesn't she know who I am, how much money I'm worth, so on and so forth? So I could quickly transition. I said, okay, first task at hand, let me get Doug and his logging crew up and going, and I'll try to revisit the 100 trees condition a little bit later on. After about a week and a half, we had our first lightning-filled thunderstorm come through, and the few scattered trees that were out there, 3 of them got hit by lightning. So that next Monday, I had a nice face-to-face meeting with Mr. Ingram on site. And suddenly my idea was a good idea. The second thing that I was successful and able to do was to impress upon him that yaupon is indestructible, and it only looks dead after it's been run over by skidders, hauling loads up to the deck, etc., and that it will come back with a vengeance, and there'll be plenty of food for his animals to graze. And the third aspect of this is when the origin of my big game hunter reputation began in East Texas. Because as I and the logging contractor quickly learned that while the red stags are very impressive animals to look at, they don't match with an active harvesting operation. And we basically bagged all 3 of his red stags because they were not afraid of the chainsaws or the skidders that were making noise. And we even got a few of the axis deers. So hence my big game hunting reputation began its start. And there were a few other twists and turns in getting this sale to close out. But one of the things that I learned was through it all, if you stay true to your convictions and you know that there are some improvements to how things are being done and how to make them go. That if you take a soft approach in trying to help explain to a landowner the other aspects and important aspects of forest management, you can be successful.
The red stags, you said you bagged 3 of them, meaning that they what?
They
Got
were
trapped under a
killed.
tree?
Yeah, one had a as the feller was operating. Keep in mind, this was all hand felled, and the red stag would during the day would bed up down closer to the stream where it was cooler, and it was so thick with yopon in there you couldn't see them. And the feller operator was not, couldn't see them. So the trees got dropped on them. The massive, stags with their, huge antlers, etc. I really thought that the noise would frighten them, but they were too domesticated, I guess, and they were not getting out of the way.
As you know, you've been involved in some of the celebration plannings for APSAF turning 100 years old and the postponement of our celebration and so on. But as we approach our 100-year-old birthday party, what thoughts do you have about the future of the profession in general, or APSAF, anything along those lines that you'd like to share?
Well, number one, congratulations to everyone, because this is truly an event that we need to celebrate. I look back and I wonder about, those foresters that, began the APSAF experience and their thoughts of the longevity of, is this really going to, be around? And we are asking ourselves maybe the same types of questions. I have to say that I would think that in another 100 years, we're going to be having a celebration of our 200th anniversary. And the reason I say that is because I've been fortunate to meet some of our young professionals. I've been, as well as some of our students, and I see their excitement and in their enthusiasm. There's certainly challenges, as there always are, and having an organization like APSAF and SAF, it provides those venues for networking and education and so on and so forth. So I'm optimistic, and I'm excited about our young leadership group that's coming in, and that will lead the organization forward for the next 100 years.
I guess just to wrap things up, how did you first join? Why did you join SAF? Why have you stayed a member?
I joined SAF while I was a green forester in East Texas back in 1976, long time ago. And I maintained that because I have a passion. I love to travel, and my forestry career also had travel within it, in that I worked in several different locations at states. And the connection was SAF. It opened a lot of doors. And as a consequence, I met a lot of good friends, SAF friends across the country. And I also felt that it opened an easy pathway for me to stay current with current techniques and research and challenges. And I'm a firm believer of when someone gives, it's also good to give back. And so hence my involvement and willingness to step forward in leadership roles. And that started in East Texas as a chapter chair, a lot of different officers, roles and positions within the chapter, moving up to at the state level, and then moving out here to the Carolinas and North Carolina, stepping forward, and then eventually serving as president, being on the board as well as serving as president. I think the one thing that our profession is so rich with is the diversity of backgrounds and people and ethnicities, and that it's people that you can count on. And that's just inherent to me as part of the profession.
Well, thank you, Joann, for all that you've done for the organization, for the profession as a whole, and thanks for sharing some of this with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking.